The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
The Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida. The shrimping industry in Florida began in Fernandina in the late 1800s and thrived in St. Augustine starting in the early 1900s. Trawlers at that time traveled as far south as Cape Canaveral. As the emphasis in St. Augustine shifted from shrimping to shrimp boat building by the mid-20th century, shrimpers started working out of Key West. Later in the century, Tampa and other Gulf Coast ports in Florida became more active. Shrimping and shrimp boat building have been important industries in Florida during the past century. While shrimping has declined here, seafood markets and restaurants still sell Florida shrimp. Welcome to Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. I'm Ben Brotemarkle. Solicito Salvatore, later known as Mike Salvador, was a Sicilian immigrant who arrived in Fernandina in 1898 and started Florida's commercial shrimping industry.
He was an architect. He was a fisherman. He was a mariner. He was an entrepreneur. And in Fernandina, in the first decade of the 20th century, he assembled what I would consider to be the greatest maritime chapter in Florida's state history. It spanned from about 1900 until the 1980s. It caused well more than $1 billion worth of fishing tonnage to be built in this state. It impacted the lives of thousands of people, directly or indirectly, 23 countries worldwide, and started a foodway that we now know and all participate in, that in the previous century was unknown.
Well, the first person who became my great uncle, and that was Solicito Salvador. And he married my grandfather's baby sister, Aunt Dominica. And they had all fished in some form or another in Sicily. And when they got here, they were catching shrimp and liked the taste of it, although it was considered the scrap of the time. That was the bycatch. You know, they were after fish, not these things with tails and feet and big eyes and whatever else. My grandfather came over to Fernandina.
The person who came first was Solicito Salvador, great uncle of Grace and myself. He came first, did some exploratory type fishing in the Fernandina area, liked what he saw, but had a false start, restarted that business later, and was joined by my grandfather, Salvatore Versaggi, and Antonio Poli, all related. They all joined the business and felt it had a future, so they began developing new techniques and improving the productivity.
By the early 1920s, Mike Salvador and his extended family moved their shrimping operation from Fernandina to St. Augustine.
They were coming down the coast shrimping, and the shrimping off of St. Augustine and down further toward Canaveral was so much better. And the port down here, the inlet, was so much deeper and better. And of course there was a heavy Catholic community here. Being the country's oldest city, that tended to make them more inclined to move down here and live here.
An uncle of ours, one of Salvatore Versaggi's sons, Joe Versaggi, was the front man to go to New York and deal with the Fulton Fish Market, the big giant wholesaler up there. And as The ability to ship shrimp, transit times 2 or 3 days developed with the advent of manufactured ice. The ability to ship to New York became more reliable, and it opened up that market. They also shipped to Chicago, to a similar place. So our Uncle Joe was the leader for the Versagis to establish a brokerage at the Fulton Fish Market, New York.
My grandfather was Salvatore Versaggi, and he had 5 sons and 2 daughters, and one of his sons, Joseph, was the one who went and interned for a while at the Fulton Fish Market and then became the broker for shrimp at the Fulton Fish Market. When it was being restored, like Quincy Market was in Boston, I said to Uncle Joe, I said, maybe they'll find some old Versaggi shrimp signs. And he said, what, are you stupid? We couldn't afford a sign. And I said, well, how did people know where to buy shrimp? And he said, they knew I had it and they found me. And I thought, well, I guess that worked back then.
You have African American families that are getting into the enterprise in fish houses as labor on the boats and as owners of some of the boats. You have Greek immigrant families that are building boats, mostly in Fernandina and St. Augustine, but other places as well, Tarpon Springs. You have Italian families, immigrant families, that are coming either directly from Italy or trans-migrating from places up north, like the Fulton Fish Market up in New York, which was a critical part of the infrastructure to get rid of shrimp. You know, catching them is half the battle. You got to sell them for the enterprise. So you have all these families that move to the region, but they bring something with them. And each of those talents conspired to form the modern commercial shrimping business.
The boats would tie up at the bridge, San Sebastian Bridge, King Street Bridge. They would back up there to where they were ready to go out the next day, and they would raft against each other all the way across the river. And as kids, we literally went from boat to boat across from one side of the San Sebastian to the other side, to the west side. And of course, the crews of the boats would chase us, but we'd outrun them.
The founder, Salvatore Versaggi, died in 1925. And my father was the oldest of 5 brothers, and there were 2 sisters. He was intending to go to law school, but changed that plan real quick to run this fleet of, at the time, 12 shrimp boats. One by one, as his brothers aged into the ability to help with the business, they all joined individually as they aged in. The war interrupted some of that effort. A couple of them got drafted off, but ultimately they ran a partnership with 5 brothers and were very successful in the shrimping business.
St. Augustine was a major port for catching shrimp really only at about the 1920s and 30s. There was a diaspora of fishing vessels that left St. Augustine in the 30s that went to Morgan City, Louisiana. They went all over the Gulf Coast. They went over to Fort Myers to expand for lots of reasons. Number one, we had more demand for shrimp, and so we needed to find richer fishing grounds. So they went to the Bay of Campeche off Mexico. They went to, after the pink shrimp boom in the 1940s and 50s, down off the Dry Tortugas.
As the shrimp started dwindling out here, it never died totally, but it started dwindling. All the different boat owners and boat fleet owners started looking for new grounds. And the Salvador brothers, Johnny and Felix, in 1949, late 1949, went to Key West.
As the shrimping industry exploded in Key West in the mid-20th century, a diverse population was drawn to the once quiet island.
The hippies certainly discovered Key West in the 1960s, 1970s. They spent time at the Sunset Festival, which is still going on in Key West. They engaged in hippie behavior, however you want to characterize that, in terms of drug use, etc. The locals responded to them in different ways. Some very positively, feeling they kind of livened up the island. Others were more critical, but they were an important part of the mix in the 60s and 70s, along with a growing gay population. The military was still there in large numbers until around 1974, when Crewman Annex, as it's now called, closed. Drug smuggling was very prominent. Shrimpers were very prominent from 1949, when they first found pink gold, as they called it, through the 70s and then into the 80s.
And the abundance was unbelievable. So they started the pink, they called it the pink gold. And the people of Key West were very much against this influx of all these boats and everything coming into Key West. They didn't have the docks to support them. They didn't have the fish house. They didn't have the ice facility. All that was ice was being trucked in.
The business started in Fernandina, moved to St. Augustine, just had some logistic advantages, and we're seeking the Bounty, which at the time was further south than Fernandina. Boats didn't have a lot of range back then. But as the boats increased in size and range capability, they began moving further south around to the Gulf. Tampa later went to Louisiana, Morgan City, Louisiana area, fishing the Gulf, on to Brownsville, Texas, and then operating that entire Gulf Coast. They would unload their boats at any of the ports out there, Aransas Pass, Brownsville, Corpus Christi. They would produce their shrimp and sell them there.
What stayed in St. Augustine, and this was really king for that area, was the ability to build the boats that supplied the fleets. And so between 1919 and 1985, I can account for about 3,500 boats that were built in town that went all over the place. And I mentioned 23 countries around the world we built boats for. We shipped them out almost by the dozen. They were rarely built on speculation. They were a well-known quantity. And during the heyday, Desco, diesel engine sales company, their motto was "the sun never sets on a Desco boat." And that's a pretty bold statement to make, but it's not bragging because it was true. And it sounds a lot like the sun never sets on the British Empire, but it was true. And it probably in some ways still is true today. And that's a legacy that Florida has left on global fishing and global foodways.
When Ed Long was production manager at Desco Marine in the mid-20th century, the company's 750 workers were producing 15 boats each month, 7 fiberglass boats, and 8 wooden trawlers. There were other boat builders in St. Augustine in addition to Desco.
Boat fleets of Versailles and the Fazios, they started expanding out too, and they went up into the Gulf off of Louisiana. They moved their fleet up there and started fishing out of there, and then down toward Texas, and then all of a sudden Campeche, Mexico was a hot spot, and Tampico. And so the boats started moving over to Brownsville, Texas, and Corpus Christi. And so they started needing more boats. And what better place to get shrimp boats was St. Augustine. So the Sayers started building more boats, the Protrudas, the Catellas, the Lanes, the Nicks, Leonard Nicks started building. Desco Marine then had a competitor across the river where the St. Augustine Yacht Place is now, at the end of Iberia Street. Modern trawlers began.
By the 1940s and 50s, really post-war years, you have a boom in it because we have labor returning from the battlefields. We have the American production system that was at its highest point ever, and probably in the country's history, able to produce wire, produce copper tubing, to produce diesel engines, all the stuff you need for a shrimp boat. And we now know how to eat it, how to eat shrimp. Shrimp were mostly an ethnic food prior to the 1920s, 30s, 40s. Maybe you would have heard of a shrimp cocktail in the big cities, but if you're in Omaha or if you're in Des Moines or if you're in Topeka, you probably didn't eat shrimp habitually. After the war, you had all these young men and women who traveled around the country, around the world. They'd gone to training camps like the Coast Guard facility in St. Augustine. They'd been in the Navy, and they had met other people and learned to do strange things like eat shrimp. So that changed. The war changed us in many ways, but it changed what we've put on our plates. And St. Augustine and a lot of other port towns started to supply that need, catching shrimp and then getting them out in the distribution networks. That was the rail system, the transportation system that really blossomed because of interstate travel in the 50s and 60s.
Following the post-World War II boom, the shrimping industry peaked in Florida in the 1980s. Today, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission says that the shrimping industry still has a $46 million impact on Florida's economy annually.
Everybody has the concept of a shrimp trawler in their head. If you grew up within 200 miles of the coast, you know what one looks like in the southeast. We go to the beach and we see them offshore, but most people know so little about them. And they really help drive this region's economy in Northeast Florida for so many years. And when fishing and boat building was down in some port towns, crime was up. That's something I've heard time and time again from people that lived through the heyday of commercial shrimping in this area.
The business ended up in two places, I would say in the 60s and 70s. It was Brownsville, Texas. They had a fleet there, and they had a fleet in Georgetown, Guyana. And that entire operation was sold, but some relatives, cousins, stayed in the business, moved it to French Guyana. Their permitting dried up there, so they went to Brazil. Same thing happened. The Brazilian government said, nope, you need a 51% partner, Brazilian, to operate here. So they moved it back to Tampa. And to this day, they operate a small fleet. It was 6 boats. They lost one a month or two back, and now they're down to 5.
In the 1970s and 80s, drug trafficking had a significant impact on shrimp boat building.
The drug trade came into the picture along that time. A lot of shrimp boats were being confiscated for hauling drugs. They came on the market as a used boat, and you could buy one for probably 20 cents on the dollar compared with a new one. A new boat we were producing was like a 75-footer was like $350,000. You could buy one off the auction block, the same boat, for about $150,000. And most of the time it was rigged. It had nets and fuel even aboard it, ready to go fishing.
When the early pioneers of commercial shrimping moved from Fernandina to St. Augustine in the early 20th century, one of the reasons they did so was to have access to the shrimp near Cape Canaveral. By the mid-20th century, the Thompson family of Titusville was catching and processing shrimp, serving it to the public in restaurants, and building innovative shrimp boats.
Shrimp boats were mostly made out of wood and steel back then.
Yes.
And so when Dad came along with this fiberglass shrimp boat, nobody would buy it. The shrimpers looked at him and they said they didn't trust fiberglass. And you have to think about it. You're 40 miles out at sea and you're in a storm. You want to make sure that your home is not going to fall apart. So they didn't trust the fiberglass.
Generational people.
Yeah.
Generational wooden shrimp boats.
Right.
Generations and generations.
So they told Dad that if God wanted boats to be made out of fiberglass, he would have made fiberglass trees.
So he was stuck with the first shrimp boat that he built. What was it, 73 foot?
73 feet, yep. And
had to bring it back home because he couldn't sell it anywhere.
So
he
he
brought it back to the port.
And that boat started catching rock shrimp.
Yeah, that boat started the rock shrimp industry.
Unlike other varieties of shrimp, rock shrimp have hard shells. Perhaps the Thompson family's greatest accomplishment was figuring out a way to prepare and serve rock shrimp at the popular Dixie Crossroads restaurant.
And I said, what if we cooked them like a lobster? If they taste like a lobster, what would happen if we cooked one like a lobster? So I went over to the drawer and I got out a steak knife and I went back to the table and I sawed open this rock shrimp. I split it right between its little feet and popped it open. And there was that evil sand vein laying right on top of the flesh. You could just take the sand vein off and there was this beautiful meat, of the rock shrimp, wide open. So Mom melted some butter. We cut open a half a dozen or so shrimp, and Mom melted some butter, and we poured butter over them and put them on a cookie sheet and put them in the broiler. And I can remember to this day the scene in Mother's kitchen of Mom and Dad peering through the top of the crack in the broiler, and the kids, peering through the sides, watching the rock shrimp cook. And they went from opaque and laying flat on the tray. Then they started cooking and their flesh turned white and started peeling away from the edge just like a lobster, and their little tails curled up and burned on the end just like a lobster. And we pulled it out and looked at it and we ate them, and we said, this is the way to cook rock shrimp.
A new monument on the San Sebastian River in St. Augustine honors the local participants in the shrimping industry. A bronze map shows where the area's fish houses, shrimp boat docks, and boat building companies were located.
From about the 1920s through the 1970s, the social and economic driver for St. Augustine was shrimping. You either worked in shrimping or you worked for the railroad. And there was really no remembrance of it. And then this whole area, all of the boat building facilities became restaurants or hotels, and I thought this should not be a footnote, in history of this town.
When we began fundraising for the monument, advertising, floating the idea, people came out of the woodwork. Oh, my father was a shrimper, my father was a crewman, my father was a boat builder, my father cut oak trees for the boat industry. It was just a sprawling network, and still is. People remembering how prominent shrimping and boat building was up through and including the 70s.
The major decline in American fishing, shrimp fishing itself, really started in the late 1960s, early 70s. There was still a boom throughout the 1970s, for sure. I mean, there were more boats in the 1970s fishing American waters for shrimp than any other period before or since. But we had more imported shrimp coming in as well.
I don't know how we will ever get the infrastructure back in place, the ice plants and the fish houses, because the fish houses have been replaced by condominiums and marinas. So the infrastructure part of it, that's a problem. We can bring back
generationally, the next generation always figured they were going to do the shrimping, and now you've got parents who are encouraging their kids not to stay in the industry because it's so hard to make a living, and you just see it getting harder and harder.
The only thing I worry about is the more regulations that were getting put on us in both the fishing and the shrimping industry, and you gotta, like us, we gotta have both to be able to stay in business, the fishing aspect and the shrimping aspect. Or more of our business is shrimp, but when you're working on such a small margin on everything, you need every little bit that you can. And the other thing is, that you don't see a lot of younger generation people getting into this industry, and I don't know if it's due to the fact that they don't like to do the hard work, because we've taken some young guys out and they don't last that long. Old timers will outwork them, and so you got that aspect, and it's expensive to get into it.
Today, if you put 10 shrimp on a plate, only one of them will be wild-caught American shrimp. The other 9 will be imported from aquaculture abroad, some wild-caught abroad, and those aren't shrimp that necessarily have a history. When you eat local shrimp, you know the quality of them. They come from our oceans that we know the quality of. And when it comes from a foreign place, there's nothing wrong with foreign food, but if it's not produced in a place where the labor, you can vouch for that amount, that quality of labor and the environment, it's not necessarily good food. And there's a dramatic difference in taste as well.
Fernandina and Mayport are still very active in shrimping, and St. Augustine is, I think there's 6 or 8 boats packing out of here now. And then you go down as far as New Smyrna. There's a few boats in New Smyrna, Canaveral, Fort Pierce, and then on down to Key West. Going northward, Georgia, Brunswick, Georgia, there's active shrimping port there, as is Savannah, Darien, Georgia. They're all shrimping ports to the north.
St. Augustine now has 6 or 7 shrimp boats, not many in comparison to the old days where you could walk across the San Sebastian River on boats, just hopping from rail to rail, and people used to talk about playing on boats as a kid and crossing the river on boats. Boats jockeying to find a place to tie up. They had trouble, with parking, in essence, on the San Sebastian River. Those days are gone. The fish houses are gone. They were never meant to last, but the industry is, and that is going away, and it's something that it's critical that we remember, number one, who it was and what it was, but also try to support our local fisheries in sustaining who they are.
While there are far fewer commercial shrimpers today, shrimp boats can still occasionally be seen trawling our coastal waters. You've been watching Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. Visit us anytime on the web at myfloridahistory.org. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ben Brotemarkle. The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
The Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida.